Welcome to Spiritual Steps, a podcast about learning to pray, listen, and grow by taking small steps on the spiritual journey. I'm your host, Stephen Hovatter, and this is episode 11, Prayer, More Than a Feeling. In this episode, I want to encourage you to approach the practice of prayer as something valuable beyond the emotional gratification that it sometimes offers. Approach it as a practice of becoming attentive to God. See, prayer is a tricky discipline, and actually, I think it's a lot like many of the other disciplines that we participate, like worship or communal study and things like this, in that sometimes prayer can offer you some sort of emotional return on what's happening. In other words, you get this kind of feedback in your heart and emotions from the experience itself. For instance, sometimes prayer can offer a sense of cleansing and acknowledgement of your forgiveness if you're in a time of prayer, and that prayer is something that as you're praying confession to God and asking God for grace and then meditating on the grace that you receive, it can offer you this sense of release from that, right? And a sense of freedom from the sin, freedom from the guilt or the shame that was a part of that. And that's a great feeling. Like that is a good response. It's a good bit of feedback emotionally for what's happening in your life of prayer. Or sometimes prayer offers you comfort or relief from anxiety. Okay, like sometimes if you're really worried or concerned about something, well, a great way to respond to that is to spend time in prayer and take it to the Lord and meditate on the security that you have in God, or just your reliance on God, no matter what's going to happen or what may come. And that gives you this emotional feedback of relief from that anxiety. It can help you feel comfort from your distress. It can help shield you from some of the negative things that are happening. It has this kind of emotional gratification that comes with it sometimes. Or sometimes it's just as simple as offering a feeling of closeness to God. And in prayer, while you're in that moment of prayer, you can feel the intensity of God's presence, and you have this awareness of God surrounding you in the world, and that there is this space in which you are meeting with God. And that feeling of closeness is, again, something that provides this emotional gratification, this emotional feedback to what you're doing. Or, finally, it can be this kind of thing where you, in prayer, are connecting with something or somebody that you love very deeply. Okay, so you perhaps are practicing some sort of intercessory prayer for somebody in your family, and you're asking God to take care of your child or to take care of somebody that you want very deeply to be in God's protection or whatever it is. And as you do that, you don't only feel close to God, you don't just feel the relief from the anxiety there, but you are really meditating on your love for that person too. And in that, you kind of have this solidification of how much you do deeply care for that person. Or maybe in a similar level, you're praying for some wrong in the world, and you're praying for some sense of justice for something that is broken that you experience in the world. And as you pray about that, you become more deeply emotionally involved in that cry for justice and that plea. And there really is this emotional feedback from doing that that's going to tie you closer to that particular cause or that particular whatever it is, okay, the cry for justice for the people group that you're praying for, like we talked about in the prayer of solidarity and all that kind of stuff. And there is, on all of these different things, there is this emotional return on our time in prayer. And that can be a good thing, right? Like sometimes our emotions are what shape us, inform us. And sometimes I believe that God teaches us and pulls us in through our prayer time, through these emotions in a way that helps us grow and helps us be formed into the image of Christ. As our hearts begin to be more aligned with the sorts of things that fill God's heart with joy or that break God's heart, we experience those things emotionally. We have the emotional return of those things, and that can be a significant and formative thing, okay? But here's the deal. there is a significant trap in that process too. And if our responses in prayer, if we become so accustomed to those things that begins the way that we interpret, whether our time in prayer was good or not, we are really set up for some really difficult things. I've been reading a lot, I may have mentioned before, in John of the Cross, who was this Spanish mystic several centuries ago. And John writes often about how beginners in prayer particularly need these sorts of emotional connections with the things that they're praying about, or they need methods of prayer that can lead them through these sorts of emotional things, like praying with images in mind or whatnot. And I really encourage those things. I think they can be really useful and helpful. But John writes about how sometimes you come in prayer, if you progress, if you grow in prayer, you come to a place where those things are stripped away and you don't get the same sort of emotional feedback, the same sort of emotional response that you have come to expect. And that is a really, really dangerous thing, because it can have at least a couple of negative effects. One of them is that you can come to this place when you don't have those emotions, and it leaves you very hollow, and it makes you feel like this particular moment, or perhaps even a long season of prayer, is somehow less than the time of prayer that you had that filled you with certain kinds of emotions, right? So when the feelings don't come, it leaves you with this hollowness, and you begin to question your own heart, your own desires. You can begin to feel guilty or ashamed by the lack of the emotions that are being provoked by your time in prayer. And it becomes a way of you being more distant to that time in prayer. So if you've come to really rely on that emotional return from prayer, or worship, or some sort of communal study or something like that, then when you get into a place where that emotional feedback doesn't come to you, then it's really, really discouraging, and it totally entices you to just, first of all, kind of judge your prayer and to evaluate it through these things that are just certainly not a part of the way that God evaluates our prayers, right? And not only that, you can kind of become so discouraged in it that you can just turn away from the practices of prayer altogether, and you abandon this thing because it doesn't give you the sort of feedback that you desire. This happens with worship all the time. We live in this culture now that prizes this sort of emotional intensity of worship, and sometimes when people don't connect with that, whether it's somebody that used to or just somebody that isn't kind of wired that way, they come and they sit in these passionate worship kind of environments, and it doesn't happen to them, and then they start questioning, well, is it really real to me, or is this something that's valuable? Because they haven't been given the tools to make any kind of different judgment about what's significant, rather than it pushes a certain set of emotional buttons, okay? So that's one of the things that can, with prayer, is that it can do the same thing, right? Like, you don't respond to prayer in the same way that you have kind of trained yourself to believe you should. And so you then can become so discouraged, and you kind of turn away from it, and you say, well, I'm just not good at prayer, or this thing isn't really for me. When, in reality, I'm sure that the Lord looks at our prayers with a completely different set of criteria than does it inflame our hearts with certain types of emotions. Okay, and the second negative thing that can really happen is that you can spend, when you think about prayer primarily in terms of something that provides this emotional gratification, is you can spend a lot of energy chasing those emotions, rather than allowing your time in prayer to simply be a discipline and a practice of attending to God. And you can be only pulled into those forms of prayer that give you that certain kind of feedback. See, I think we're better off if you just come into prayer as something that, sometimes might lead you through certain kinds of emotions, and you want to think about those and reflect on them when they do happen. But think about prayer as something that is more than that. It's more than a feeling. It is this practice of taking yourself and attending to God, putting your attention to God, and then doing that regularly over time, over years and years and years, whether you feel like it or not, so that you are in the habit of seeking the will of God, the habit of seeking the mind of God. And as you do that over time, you become more aligned with what God wants for the world and for you and for the church. And that's what you're really after. It's that business of alignment, of formation, of connection with God. Not the feeling of the connection with God, but the real thing. The real thing that comes with being attentive to following the Lord over a long period of time, where you allow yourself to be transformed into the image of Christ. That is what prayer is about. It is about our communion with God, our transformative communion with God. So I want to encourage you, don't worry about the emotional aspects of prayer. Don't feel like you have to kind of like work yourself into that, or that your prayer is a failure if certain types of emotions don't naturally come. Prayer isn't about those things. There are times where you will receive certain positive emotions, some positive emotional feedback from your prayer. And there may be times where your prayer leaves you with some sort of negative feelings. But don't judge your prayer by those things, okay? Rather, let your prayer just be an act of faithfulness, where over time you attend to this discipline, to this practice in a way that draws you closer to God. That's all for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll take time to subscribe if you haven't done that in iTunes or whatever your podcast app of choice is. We'll be back soon with a new episode. Until then, keep taking the next step that you see in front of you, and may God be with you on each step of your journey. Peace.